And before I pass the word to the speakers, I will explain briefly the format. The session will last 90 minutes. After the speaker presentation, we will have a 20 minutes Q&A discussion. Questions will be selected by the moderator from the ones submitted only via Zoom Q&A option. Please try and keep your questions short and to the point. This will make it easier for the panelists to answer. Last, I'd like to thank our invited speaker. I believe they don't require any introduction, and all participants are anxious to hear their thoughts. It's truly a great honor to have you, José Alexandre, Edward, Adam, Sheridan, and Luigi with us. So, without further ado, I pass the word to José Alexandre, who will also moderating this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you and Rui for the invitation, and thank the panelists for volunteering to participate in this meeting. I'm going to make a very short introduction. We have 3 truly excellent papers on the subject. Shows how much the economics profession has been touched and reacted to the pandemic. So our first speaker would be Ed Glaeser from Harvard University. He'll speak about pandemics in cities. He'll be followed by Adam Sheridan from Copenhagen, who speak about social distancing laws cause only small losses of economic activity during COVID-19 pandemic in Scandinavia. And finally, by Luigi Zingales, my former colleague from University of Chicago, who will speak about pandemics and civil power. Ed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose. Jose, of course, didn't mention that I am also his student. I have learned from him for over 30 years, and I am delighted to be learning from him as well today. So if I may, I'm going to try and share my screen. I'm going to talk about a series of papers that deal with COVID-19 and cities. I actually should have a new paper next week that's specifically on the financial implications of the Paycheck Protection Act, but that is not that unfortunately was not ready for this presentation. So without anything else, let's try sharing screen. Okay, and one more thing. Slideshow.
Good, it's working.
Current slide. Good. Okay, great. This is joint work with a lot of people. Mike Lucas, Zoe Cullen, Chris Stanton, Marion Bertrand, Alex Bartek, Stephen Redding, Caitlin Gorbeck, JP Shalvin, Stephanie Kesselman. Jose told me not to speak quickly, but I'm speaking quickly just to get through. Okay. Cities and pandemics have a long history. The first historical discussion of an urban pandemic was the plague that hit Athens in 430 BC, of which this more likely a biblical plague painted by Poussin, is sometimes taken to be a depiction of. The backstory for the plague of Athens was that Pericles had summoned the Athenians in behind their walls, behind the city walls, with the strategy that they would allow those walls to protect them against Sparta's superiority on land and send the Athenian boats out to harass the Peloponnesian coastline. This was a great piece of military strategy, except the walls were not effective against bacteria. And so, despite the fact that they kept out the Spartan hoplites, they did not keep out the disease that came in through the Port of Piraeus and lay waste to the city. Thucydides is full of description of not just the death, but the social chaos that followed it. And I think it seems clear that the golden age of Athens, perhaps the brightest of all lights of Europe's urban classical world, were dimmed significantly after this plague. They would eventually lose the war to Sparta over 20 years afterwards. This plague was perhaps even less important than the plague of Justinian, which came to Constantinople in 541. That Byzantine emperor looked like he was on the cusp of recreating the Pax Romana throughout the Mediterranean world when the first appearance of Yersinia pestis shows up in a Western city. Constantinople is devastated, the Byzantine army is devastated, and political chaos rules for the next 200 years, shoving Europe into perhaps 8 or 9 centuries of rural poverty. This does not mean that this is always what happens with plagues in cities, but the consequences of screwing it up can be very dire indeed. Now, in some sense, for all of us, we've lived through a remarkably blessed century in which we have, our cities have by and large been healthy. Life expectancy in New York has been, at least prior to COVID-19, 2 years longer than the national average. But that is very much against the normal historical record. Throughout most of history, cities have been killing fields from contagious diseases. There are both tremendous upsides and downsides from density. We learn from each other, we work together, we buy and sell with each other when we're near to one another, but we also congest our roads, we also enable crime, and the most terrible of all the demons of density is contagious disease. You can see here a map of the death rates in New York City over the past 200 years. Keep in mind that in many cases, these are going up about 5% per annum. So this is 20 times higher than the death rate that New York saw from COVID-19 during some of the cholera episodes of the 19th century. Fixing this, making the cities of the West livable, required enormous investments in infrastructure as well as incentives and institutions. So America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water and sewerage at the start of the 20th century as the federal government, as their national government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. And of course, it's not just enough to build the sewers, you also have to put incentives in place to make people use them. You will notice that in 1842, New York built the Croton Aqueduct, an enormous engineering achievement. And yet for 25 years afterwards, the city continued to die of cholera. My great-great-great-grandfather died in the 1849 cholera epidemic 7 years after the Croton Aqueduct opened. That was because New York did not solve the last mile problem. Just as in sub-Saharan Africa today, where I do work on water, the poor people were not willing to pay for connections. They continued to use their shallow wells and their pit latrines, and they continued to die. It's only after 1866, where they impose essentially Pigouvian taxes on tenement owners that force them to connect to the water system, that New York really sees a downturn in mortality. And over the past 150 years, you would be forgiven for thinking that these plagues, these influenzas, are things that cities can handle. After all, the 1919 influenza was something that cities basically shrugged off and experienced one of the great urbanizing decades in the 10 years after that. But pandemic is back with us. And as usual, it hits big cities first, both because cities are the nodes of the transportation networks that connect continents and because plague spreads more readily in dense areas. This shows the relationship as of mid-May between COVID cases per capita and population density across American counties. And this is a regression table that just shows the first three are cases, the second three are deaths across counties. We're controlling for log populations, so you can interpret that as a per capita case number. Density has a coefficient of about 0.2. Public transit usage is strongly positively correlated with it, and share African American is strongly positively correlated with COVID cases and COVID death rates as well. Age is negatively associated with cases, presumably that reflects protective behavior on the part of the old, but positively associated with deaths. I have not yet gotten a full paper on Brazilian data. We are moving forward to this. This is together with JP Chauvin and Stephanie Kesselman. We have a data set of all the non-pharmaceutical interventions that have been done on the municipality level in Brazil. Right now, I can just tell you that we have results like this: larger share of the population living in a favela, significantly higher case rates across Brazilian municipalities. Unsurprisingly, density and poverty go together with the spread of disease. And in a regression format, density matters less than it does in the US context, but it's really share living in a favela that really matters. Notice that race is also important in this case. Okay, race is also matters in the Brazilian context just as it matters in the American context. I see these things as being quite parallel to each other. I don't have full tables for India. What I do have is a scattergram, thanks to Sam Asher and Paul Novosad, looking at the share of population living in slums, and again, showing higher rates of infections in India. These infection rates are much lower, but they still show the relationship with population density that we thought. Now, one of the things that has become most interesting and contentious is the role of public transit in facilitating the flow of COVID-19. Certainly, passengers are terrified of it. 80% of Massachusetts residents said they would not be comfortable taking buses, subways, and commuter trains when it's allowed. Even with a treatment, that 57% said they would not be comfortable, only with a vaccine. And so there's a question as to whether or not the relationship that you just saw between public transit use and COVID cases across counties is actually real. There's actually no relationship within the New York data. So across New York City zip codes, public transit usage is completely orthogonal to this. And this is the positive rate across counties. So what's going on? Why is public transit usage associated with COVID across counties, but not within New York? The reason is behavioral adjustment. And I think that's sort of the critical element that's often missing in many of these SIR models that the epidemiologists look at. So this is cases per capita. You can see it's lower in where Jose lives in downtown areas of Manhattan. It's lower in the inner areas of Brooklyn. And many of those areas are also relatively high in terms of public transit usage, particularly the Brooklyn areas during normal years. But now let's look at what happened to mobility. And here we're using the SafeGraph data on mobility across zip codes during the COVID period. And what you can see is, first of all, the downtown areas of Manhattan are the areas that really shut down. So they are the areas in which people stopped moving. And you can also see that the inner areas of Brooklyn, where public transit usage is quite high, are also the areas in which people shut down. So the reason why public transit doesn't predict COVID across New York is not that public transit isn't spreading COVID, but that public transit usage traditionally isn't associated with mobility today because those public transit areas took protective measures, because they shut down their mobility. We can show you this. This is travel change in COVID cases. So this is the relationship between those places that reduced their amount of travel are places that had less COVID. So immobility led to protection, unsurprisingly. And immobility was related to public transit. These facts inspired a recent paper that I wrote with Stephen Redding and Caitlin Gorback, trying to estimate the elasticity of COVID prevalence with respect to mobility in New York and 4 other cities. In this case, we tried to deal with the reverse causality problem that higher levels of COVID might lead you to reduce your trips. And so what we did is we used the occupational mix pre-COVID. So some occupations find it easier to engage in teleworking, some occupations do not. Some occupations were essential, some occupations were not. And so we use these as instruments. And this is what we get. These are the multi-city estimates, and I think I probably want to push you to look at number 4, number 5, and number 7 are the right regressions to look at. So number 5 controls for individual attributes and gives you the ordinary least squares coefficient of change in trips and change on cases. This is just a cross section. Number 7 uses the instrumental variable approach of using the occupations. You get a coefficient of 0.007, which is about an elasticity of 1. So that means about a 10% reduction in the number of trips is associated with a 7% reduction in the amount of COVID cases. So it's a pretty big relationship. In the IV, that rises to almost 3, so an even larger number. So those zip codes that had lots of people who were in essential services or in services that couldn't telework, those were the ones that got higher COVIDs, and that's a very high elasticity indeed. We also do this with a panel in New York City. Here we allow the instruments to have different coefficients week by week. I want to push you mostly towards regression 6, which is probably the most natural one, and you might want to compare that with regression 1. So in the panel, you get nothing in terms of OLS and SafeGraph trips, perhaps because of the reverse causality. You get an elasticity of about 1.6 in the IV estimate. So 10% fewer trips, 16% fewer COVID cases. This uses a different measure of trips. This is the MTA, the public transit turnstile data. So this is the usage of these turnstiles using the same instrument. Here, the OLS effects are quite strong. In terms of statistical significance, the coefficients are about 0.4, so an elasticity of 0.4 in OLS, but an elasticity of about 3 in terms of the instrumental variable. So these do suggest that at least in New York in this time period, immobility was a very powerful predictor and a very strong explanatory variable for making sense of why richer areas didn't get COVID, as they were the ones that found it easier to shut down. Now, in some sense, the occupational mix, helps us understand why this pandemic is such a sort of, body blow against urban America, and in fact, against the urban world, that if you think about the arc of employment in the United States and globally, from farm to factory to urban service workers, right? We understand why that's happened. The ability to serve coffee with a smile, right, has been a safe haven for employment for less skilled Americans, right? These jobs, the 32 million American workers who labor in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade, those have been the one place for them to go as the factories have shut down, as the factories have engaged in capital deepening and automation. And yet those jobs are uniquely vulnerable either to the disease itself or to the fact that if having a person sell you a coffee is no longer a source of pleasure, you can make your coffee at home with a machine without any problem, right? All of these urban service jobs can disappear on a dime if people are afraid of interpersonal communication in a pandemic. This just shows you the pattern of employment. The light blue line that starts at the top and ends in the bottom is manufacturing. The middle lines are leisure, hospitality, and retail trade. Again, 1/5 of the American labor force, the most vulnerable. And the top two lines, so professional and business services, those are the wealthier Americans who are still zooming their way towards employment, and education and health services. So those jobs are relatively safe, but of course, many of those workers are the most vulnerable to disease. Together with Chris Stanton, Zoe Cullen, Mike Luca, Alex Bartik, and Marion Bertrand, we've been doing a series of surveys of small businesses through the Alignable Network. And our small business data really shows fairly cataclysmic closure rates. This is as of April 1. Across all our sample, 45% of the businesses were currently closed. That ranges from a lower level in banking and finance, 19%, to a higher level of, let's say, 70% in arts and entertainment. Somewhat shockingly, these businesses really expected to be, large numbers of these businesses expect to be closed in December as well. So this is sort of a very, major hit for the American small business ecosystem. This data is not just sort of fanciful. When we use this data to predict the unemployment rate across states, or sorry, the unemployment rate across counties using official data, it's fairly strongly correlated with it. So those places where we think we have higher small business closures are those places that have higher levels of unemployment. We asked them, we gave them different hypothetical lengths for the scenario, and we asked them about their expected survival rates. And we found the small businesses were very sensitive to the length of the crisis. So if the crisis lasted for 4 or 6 months, the number of restaurants that would be able to survive dropped from 72% to 30%, at least in their own prognosis. If you take those numbers seriously, the number of workers who would be fired if the crisis lasts for 4 months or longer would be 32 million. Because of these closings. So it's really an enormous disruption. It's not as if, we frequently heard from the White House and elsewhere that, all we have to do is restart the economy by reopening our rules. In fact, many of these businesses expect to be closed at least 2 or 3 weeks after the rules allowed them to reopen. That's what this is showing, the gap between months until reopening and months until the restrictions lift. And the primary reason for this is that they are expecting, these small businesses, particularly in the services and trade area, massive reductions in demand. So just look at the as of September numbers, you get the mean expected demand relative to pre-COVID levels, the most of which is 70% in finance insurance, down to 55%. And these are the share of firms that think that they'll be 90% or higher, and almost none of them do. So I certainly have never seen this kind of expected reduction in demand in my lifetime. It's certainly an enormous disruption. The last thing I want to say something about is whether or not this shift in the way that we work will likely to become permanent. And obviously, in some sense, all this social distancing is a remarkable de-urbanizing of our world. Cities at their heart are the absence of physical space between people and firms, and we have gone from living close to each other to being very separate. Will this become permanent by learning Zoom? Will we stay doing Zoom? This confirms, this uses our alignable data to confirm a very prescient paper done by Jonathan Dingle and Neyman, who used work characteristics to predict which occupations could stay home. It turns out the occupations that they predicted could stay home are the occupations that are staying home. So in fact, they did a remarkably good job of predicting across industries. What variables predict which of these industries are able to stay home? Above all, it's share of the population with a college degree. So this is a substantially inequitable hit, in the sense that educated people are able to take use of the technology, less educated people are not. And education does almost as good of a job as the Dingle and Neyman data in terms of predicting which industries have been able to stay home. These are assessments of how well at-home working is doing. Again, education is the prime predictor, more strongly than anything else in our data. Large firms, by the way, think that this is less productive, which suggests that the complementarities that are involved in working at large firms may indeed be lost when you're shifting to at-home working. What did our surveys tell us about how much of these shifts are likely to become permanent? Well, in the alignable data, 40% or more of the firms say that 40% or more of their workers who switched will stay switched. 40% or more of the firms said 40% or more of the workers who switched stayed switched. We also asked the National Association of Business Economists the same question, and in that case, we had 36% of the businesses said that 40% or more of their workers who stayed switched will stay switched. So potentially, this is a very large shift in demand for urban commercial space. what do I think will happen for cities? I think it really depends on the duration of the pandemic and whether or not we take the investments that we need to make sure that this pandemic is a one-shot deal. If it's a one-shot deal, it still is a major shock. Okay, in rich cities, it doesn't mean, completely empty office towers. After all, we have a price mechanism. The prices will drop. You will have a shift of people who occupy these spaces. You'll have more younger people living in cities. Cities still maintain a tremendous allure as places of consumption rather than production, which means you'll have a reallocation from commercial space to residential space, and that's likely to continue. We saw this in terms of young people immediately crowding into the Sunbelt cities when they could get out. Our roads may get either less or more congested. If we have people moving to lower density locales, that may mean that they end up driving longer distances. So this is not likely to permanently solve traffic congestion. And international travel is likely to be sorely depressed for quite some time. So this is why events like this, where we connect across oceans and continents via Zoom, are more important than ever. Because as much as I would like to be in Brazil in person, this is going to be hard for quite some time. Now, if the shock doesn't end quickly, if this thing lasts for 3 years, if we get another pandemic within 5, all bets are off. That in fact, American cities may substantially reallocate themselves, at least the wealthy world. Now, poor people will still come to cities. And Brazil, of course, is a middle-income country between those two extremes. But I think if you think about Africa or India, right, if you look at the urbanization that occurred in 19th century America, when the death rates from pandemics were considerably higher than COVID-19, I think there's every reason to believe that urbanization will continue in those places despite the diseases. Brazil probably lives between those two extremes. But at least for me, there's one ray of hope, which is that if this bad outcome occurs, this will be a terrible shock for all low-skilled American labor. That in fact, all of labor where, 2 years ago before this happened, I was very keen that I had this sort of vision of urban service jobs for less skilled Americans going forward for the next 30 or 40 years, less skilled Brazilians as well, but I didn't know what would happen to employment in West Virginia. I couldn't imagine what they would do in West Virginia. In some sense, if pandemic risk shuts down all urban service workers, then we all become West Virginia. Okay, then we're all looking at a job market that looks like that. And I think for that reason, there are strong political incentives to make sure that this never happens again, and to do the preemptive investments in virology, epidemiology, preemptive vaccination, and so forth, that can at least try and make sure that this is as likely as possible to be a one-shot deal. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it back over to Jose.
Thank you, Ed, for this great lecture, as always. I am proud that you're my student, but I don't like to boast so too much. Actually, Ed's exposition goes very well with what Adam is going to talk about, because I think at the center of Ed's talk was the importance of behavioral changes, how much behavioral changes have affected both contagion and death rates, etc. And Adam is going to talk exactly about this. So I'll let Adam, who's going to talk about the experiences of Sweden and Denmark during the early part of the pandemic. Adam.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I'll just share my screen. Yeah, I agree. That was a great, I think there's a very clear link between this project that I've been working on with my colleagues at the University of Copenhagen. So it's Asger, Emil, and Niels Johannesson. So social distancing laws, often referred to as shutdowns or lockdowns, are the defining policy instrument of the COVID-19 crisis. So the idea is that by closing down certain private businesses, one can control the extent that the pandemic spreads and save lives. And I think that it's fair to say that right now, all around the world, governments are engaging in live, ongoing policy discussions about whether to close down their economies if they haven't closed already, to reopen if they have closed, and as is the case across regions of Europe right now, whether to reclose. So as the virus increases again in prevalence after previous reopenings, whether they should shut down again. At the center of a lot of these discussions and ongoing decision-making, there is a perceived policy trade-off that's spoken a lot about among economists and policymakers. And the idea is that these social distancing laws might save people's lives, but they can cost money, that they can harm the economy. And this paper is about one side of that trade-off. So in this paper, we want to try to answer the question, what are the costs of social distancing laws in terms of lost economic activity? And now this is, I think, a more more difficult question to answer than it might have first seemed, because there are two moving parts affecting economic activity during a pandemic and around the time at which a country shuts down. So on the one hand, there are the direct effects of the shutdown. So people who wish to go out and consume can no longer do so. So you end up with potentially a drop in economic activity because people just can't go out and buy and spend the things that they want to spend their money on. On the other hand, there are potentially important direct effects of the virus itself. So if people are concerned about their own personal health risks, or as I think we're going to hear a bit more about from Luigi, if people have a sense of civic duty to stay home and socially isolate in order to stop the spread of the virus, that in itself will reduce economic activity, even if there is no intervention from the government. I think that this second direct effect of the virus itself opens up the possibility for a potentially important indirect effect of shutdowns. So the idea is if shutdowns can reduce the extent of the pandemic, and there's a body of evidence, some of the things that Ed showed today suggest that these restrictions in movement can result in lower virus prevalence, then this can actually reduce the need for people to take their own decisions to shelter from the virus and actually lead to improved economic outcomes. So as a result of these two different direct effects and this potentially important indirect effect, I think that the answer to this question is ambiguous. So the extent of this trade-off is ambiguous. And I think that it's fair to say we're trying to provide some of the first causal evidence that will get at this trade-off, especially in terms of the economic costs of shutdowns. And so the way that we do that, again, there's this kind of key identification problem we have to face. So the problem is that by design, governments tend to introduce social distancing laws at the point at which pandemic intensity is increasing. And this means that just comparing within a given country, comparing what happens to economic activity from before to after, we won't know if the drop in economic activity that we observe is a result of the shutdown itself or as a result of the escalating pandemic. And so we overcome this problem by exploiting real-time bank transaction data and a natural experiment in Scandinavia, an ongoing natural experiment. And so Denmark and Sweden, the neighbor countries, were similarly exposed to COVID-19. They had very similar early outbreaks, but only Denmark mandated social distancing. I'm sure many of you have heard about kind of what's been referred to as the Swedish experiment. There's been very limited restrictions in Sweden on the activities of private businesses and on individuals. And so what this difference in policy allows us to do, given this difference in early exposure, is that we can use spending behavior in Sweden as a counterfactual for what would have happened in Denmark absent social distancing mandates. The idea is that by looking at what happens in Sweden, we can see what would have happened in Denmark if they hadn't gone on a shutdown. And I think an important point to stress here is we're not trying to hold infection risk constant. So an important reason why shutdowns might benefit the economy is that they prevent an increase in pandemic intensity, which itself feedbacks into spending, and we want to account for that. So the basic idea behind our empirical strategy is to compare changes in spending around the Danish shutdown date across Denmark and Sweden to isolate this causal effect of mandated social distancing. And just to give you an overview of what we find, so our first result is that there is a massive drop in spending in both Denmark and Sweden, and it's only marginally greater in Denmark due to this mandated social distancing. And this suggests that most of the economic contraction, most of the drop in economic activity we've seen around shutdowns is caused by the virus itself. The second result that we look at, that we find, is we try to look into this indirect mechanism, the potential benefits of shutdowns. And we find that actually the elderly, so those most at risk of severe health consequences from contracting COVID-19, they actually spend more under the shutdown than absent mandated social distancing. So social distancing laws seem to work by limiting the spread of the virus and enable more economic activity among those who face the highest risks. So I'll just give you a little bit of background, get into the details of the paper. I think there's two things that I'm going to stress. The first is about the similarity of the outbreak, which is important for believing these estimates as a causal effect of social distancing. And the second thing is, so from the similarity of the outbreak, the very different policy responses. And I think this graph kind of summarizes the evolution of the COVID-19 pandemic in Denmark and Sweden. And what it does is it plots excess all-cause mortality on a weekly basis throughout 2020 up to about the second week of April. And so this is calculated just as the percentage change in the total mortality rates in each country relative to a historical average in each of those weeks of 5 years previously. And you can see it in Denmark in green, for Sweden in yellow, and Italy as a point of comparison in pink. And there are kind of two important things that this graph shows. And the first is that up until early March, Denmark and Sweden had very similar trends in excess mortality. There's no evidence to suggest that the pandemic intensity was greater in either of these two countries. And by point of contrast, you can see that in Italy, excess mortality was already increasing from late February. You can then see around the dotted horizontal line, this is when Denmark begins its shutdown, that around 2 to 3 weeks after that point in time, there's a big divergence in excess mortality. So rates of mortality in Sweden increased quite dramatically and much less so in Denmark, suggesting, this is kind of suggestive evidence that the shutdown in Denmark reduced the prevalence of the disease, reduced mortality, and this is what we want to capture in our estimate of the shutdown effect too, this avoidance of this extra risk of contracting the illness. You can see the similar thing for excess Google searches, that they follow similar trends in terms of people searching for symptoms and illnesses. So from this very similar background, the countries adopted very, very different policies. So from the 11th of March, Denmark introduced social distancing laws, which was similar to much of Northern Europe, less extreme than in Southern Europe, just reflecting the differences in pandemic intensity. And the key laws that Denmark introduced for the purposes of this paper was a full or partial shutdown of a range of private businesses, from restaurants and bars and cafes through to cinemas, nightclubs, malls, and personal care services like dentists and hairdressers. In contrast to Denmark, and I think in contrast to almost every other higher income country, Sweden introduced almost no binding social distancing laws and only some recommendations. So restaurants, bars, cafes, malls, and hairdressers have all remained open throughout the pandemic with limited restrictions. So restaurants and bars and cafes are only allowed to do table service, but they've still remained open. And the first time the government actually issued recommendations to limit social interactions, if possible, was the 27th of March. So this is quite late, given what we know about the exponential spread of the disease. So there's, from this very similar starting point, there were very different policy choices made, and we're going to use this in combination with some data in order to get at the causal effect of shutdowns. And so the data that we use for this study is bank account transaction data for a large sample of active customers at one of the major Scandinavian banks. So that's Danske Bank. They're one of the largest banks in the region. We have information for almost 800,000 customers of the bank in Denmark and around 100,000 customers in Sweden. And for each of those customers, we can observe every outflow from their accounts. This allows us to make a really precise and comprehensive measure of their individual level daily spending for each customer. So we aggregate up all of the card payments, cash withdrawals, payments by mobile phone, and invoices for online shopping. So we can measure individual level spending and aggregate spending in the economy. We can then also go deeper than that and measure spending on specific categories of consumption, especially those involving high social proximity, so going out to restaurants or bars, and that's using an international standard classification of merchants. One other advantage of this bank data, using this sort of data for this study, is that the bank has a lot of information on the customers, and we can use a lot of that information. So for example, gender, age, location, whether urban or rural, which could be important for the response to the pandemic, and also income. And we can use that data to assess how similar the samples are across countries and make sure we're comparing similar people in each country when we do our estimation procedure. And there's two things that I'd like to point out about the data that are quite important for the design. So first is that Danske Bank are the biggest bank in Denmark. They cater to all customer segments, which means that they actually are representative of the population at large. So when I talk about changes in spending in aggregate in Denmark, that reflects well changes in spending in the whole of Denmark. The second important point is that the customer base is actually very similar in Sweden. There are some differences in terms of income, age, gender share, and other variables, but we have lots of observations in order to adjust for these remaining imbalances. So we can reweigh our estimates from Sweden so that the sample looks a lot more like the Danish sample, which is provides a convincing counterfactual for what we see going on in Denmark. So let me just get to the results, talk these through. So the first thing I want to show is just the trends in aggregate spending in the sample over time for Denmark on the top and Sweden on the bottom. So this red line in each graph shows total spending on each day in 2020 from January through to the 5th of April. And it's scaled relative to average daily spending in 2019. So it hovers up and down around 100. And the gray line shows the equivalent series for 2019. And there are two kind of important takeaways. The first is that up until mid-February, before the pandemic had really reached the shores of Scandinavia, the trends in 2020 were very similar to the trends in 2019. And the red line, the 2020 data, is slightly above the 2019 data. And this difference is just our best guess at the counterfactual growth in spending that we would have seen if the pandemic had not arrived. So the next important thing to notice is that after around the Danish shutdown date, so on the 11th of March, we see a dramatic drop in spending in 2020 that happens in both Denmark and in Sweden. And what we'll show is that this drop in Denmark, this drop in the same time in both countries is not about the social distancing laws, it's about the similarly escalating pandemic that's responsible for this change in consumption behavior. And so in order to isolate that effect, to estimate this causal shutdown effect, we do two things. So the first is to estimate the spending drop in each country through the pandemic and any of the policies that were introduced in each country afterwards, so the shutdown or fiscal stimulus responses. And we do that by calculating how much lower spending is. So this red area, basically, how much less spending there is in 2020 after the Danish shutdown. And then we also calculate how much do we think spending would have grown in that period based on the early part of the year. And so doing the difference between the drop post-shutdown in Denmark and this counterfactual growth gives us an estimate of the total effect of the COVID-19 pandemic and the policy response in each country. Second, to isolate just the effect of the shutdown in Denmark, we can just compare the difference in those spending drops. So the spending drop in Denmark over and above what we see in Sweden will be the causal shutdown effect. And we also reweigh observations in Sweden to match Denmark, but it doesn't make a difference for our estimates. So let's just kind of look at these results. So this graph summarizes the findings. You can see the top two bars are the country-specific estimates of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis as a whole. So these are just massive drops in spending, similar to what we've seen in other countries. So about 29% lower spending in Denmark, 24% in Sweden. If you think about the average unemployment event in the US and in Denmark too, affects spending by about 6 to 10%. This is really a huge drop in consumption. The difference between those, the effect of the shutdown, is the blue bar on the bottom, and we can see that that's about 4 percentage points. So the majority of this drop in spending seems to be caused by the virus itself and not the shutdown policies. We then try to look at these, isolating the potential positive impact of shutdowns for certain groups of people by comparing how the shutdown effect varies across the age groups of people in each country. So we know that COVID-19 is much more risky for the elderly than the young. And we know that a shutdown is likely to affect spending through two channels. So it will lower the supply of some goods. You can't go out to your restaurants, but it will also lower the risk of other goods that you can still continue to go out and buy, for example, groceries. And one hypothesis is that for the high risk, the elderly, this lower risk is going to matter more for them, suggesting that they might have a smaller shutdown effect, and vice versa for the young, who are low risk themselves. So lowering risk in general is going to make less of a difference to their behavior if they care about their own personal risks when they make their decisions. And what we can see here is just, this is the causal effect of the shutdown by age group. So from 18 to 29 up to 70 plus. And the key takeaway here is this positive coefficient for the elderly. So the shutdown actually results in a smaller drop in spending among the people who are most at risk of the virus than if the government had decided not to shut down. We also show that this age gradient in spending holds across many different categories of high social contact spending. So I think one that I want to look at to stress here is this result in public transport because it relates to what Ed has spoken about. So actually the elderly is insignificant, but there's some signs that the elderly in Denmark actually reduce their spending on public transport, moving around in cities and towns, less under the shutdown than they do in Sweden. So just to kind of sum it up and bring up some discussion points. So our conclusion is that the virus is responsible for most of the shutdown, that this trade-off is much less steep between lives and the economies, is much less stark than one might have guessed based on the big drops in spending we've seen around the time that countries have shut down. There are some kind of interesting considerations for how this result might hold and might be relevant for other countries and other regions of the world. So I want to note that there's been similar patterns in the US. So Chetty and co-authors have shown that spending was falling before shutdowns in the US. But of course, there's some other important considerations. So if it's civic duty that motivates a lot of the virus-induced spending drop, it's potentially important to recognize that there may be differences in the extent to which people are motivated by a sense of civic duty to respond to in their own behavior. The shutdown effect might also vary with demography. So in younger lower income countries, where people have lower personal risks of going out and spending money, there might be smaller shutdown effects. Although if the age gradient in mortality is different, so if it's shallower in lower income countries, it could be that the shutdown effect is actually even smaller. There's a potential one. And I want to finish on just saying what's happened since the end of this study period in the paper. So we're working on updating some of the results, but it's not been possible to do it for Sweden yet. But this is just weekly changes in spending in Denmark. There's been a reopening from about week 18, and we can see that as the pandemic has reduced in prevalence and the economy has opened up, spending in Denmark is almost back to normal now. And evidence from Sweden, from other sources, suggests that that's not true there. So it's potential that over the medium run, the effects of a shutdown are actually positive. So that's kind of what I wanted to finish with. Looking forward to the discussion in the next talks.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for a great talk. You know, when I was asked to organize this session, I just thought about 3 papers that I liked and invited the authors to present. But in fact, they're much more connected. They connect extremely well. One of the questions I think I had asked Adam when we started corresponding about this paper was, what if you have lots of crazy people like in some US red states or parts of Brazil? What would happen to these results? And I think that Luigi's paper is really about that. So he could give us, he ties in very well with this, because it's really about how social capital affects pandemics. So Luigi, your turn now. Thank you.
Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
What I can see is not fully, you have just the slides and it's not full frame yet. I don't know if you want to do full frame.
Is it full frame now?
No, I think a little, no.
Let me try another solution. Is it full frame now?
It's getting smaller. I think you should go back.
That's not good.
That's okay, even if it's
No. Let's start again and see what I can do better. Okay, just 1 second.
There's a command to make things full screen.
No, it's because, it's because I have a share screen here, and when I have a share screen here, things don't work properly. So I need to block my share screen here, which I've done, and then hopefully, let's see, if I do now, and I go here, that is any better?
That's okay. I think we have to do with this. Oh, it says double click. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So this is a joint paper with John Barrios, Efraim Bemelek, Yael Ockberg, and Paola Sapienza. And it actually, as Jose said, the motivation is very simple, is in the fight for COVID-19, most governments around the world faced 2 types of constraints. One constraint was technological. For example, how many tests per day can be administered. But there was another constraint that I think we see less attention, which is what I call the social constraint. How do we ensure adequate compliance with public health recommendations, realizing that even in the most totalitarian states like China, there is an element of voluntary cooperation, because it's very difficult to enforce if the population is not cooperative. So the question is an old question in economics: what drive voluntary compliance? And to some extent, one role in that is the willingness of individuals to consider the welfare of others in making their decision. So this is a concept that goes back to the idea of civic capital. That is a very long standing idea. In a previous paper with Luigi, Glaeser, and Paula, we define civic capital as the set of values and beliefs that help a group overcome the free rider problem in the pursuit of socially valuable activities. So think about civic capital as the following: in making a decision, an individual puts a weight on aggregate social welfare, where this weight lambda reflects a degree of civic capital. And this weight can be between 0 and 1, can be 0 if you're completely sort of selfish. I don't think for most people is 1, but anyway. So if you decide whether to stay home to protect others from the risk of being infected, when the decision is not mandatory, let sort of 10 be the cost of complying and 50 the net social benefit of complying. An individual will compare the private cost 10 with the social benefit 50, where the latter is weighted by the lambda. And so if lambda is bigger than 1/5, for example, she will comply. If not, she will not. So that's a very simple way to formalize this idea. Now, of course, the question is, where does this civic capital come from? This is something we don't discuss in this paper. However, you can think about this as the result of religion, education, historical experiences, a lot of other things. So the only thing we need for this paper is that civic capital is a relatively stable characteristic of a community, and it is measurable. So the question that we try to address in this paper is, do communities with more civic capital behave in a more civic-minded way during the early phases of the COVID-19 pandemic? And the challenges are multiple, but one is that how do we measure civic-minded behavior? And 2, how do we measure civic capital? And 3, how do we select the relevant samples? So let me start with an example. This is the United States. The United States apply stay-home, work-safe mandates at very different time in very different states. Now, many of these guidelines were fairly voluntary because there wasn't much of an enforcement. So the idea is, can we measure how much they comply to that? And this is where technology comes in very handy, because with cell phone, we can look at how individuals behave. So Google has shared some of the data of their phones, and this is aggregate location of users. To show that this is not just specific of Google, we use other data set, but they're all based on the same idea. So the idea is, Google calculates how many visits and length of stay at different places you do, and compared to a baseline. In this case, the baseline is the same day of the week for the period, on average, for the period January 3rd to February 6th. So assuming that there was no impact in behavior before, you look at the changes in behavior during this period. Now, as measure of civic capital, we're going to use 3. The first one is an old one that even Putnam used almost 30 years ago, and was the electoral participation. And the idea is, think about the model of civic mindedness. We economists cannot explain with selfish individual why people vote, because the cost of voting exceeds the private benefits of voting. So you need to have some form of civic mindedness to vote, and we think that that can be captured by the average participation, and this is from some MIT data on presidential election. But just to prove robustness, we use other measures that have been developed in the US about the social capital. And when these measures are not available, we look at trust towards other people in general. Now, Ed has a paper many years ago showing that trust is in fact trustworthiness. And I think in many communities, this ends up being the same thing, because I trust other people because I think they are trustworthy, and most other people look like me. And so the two things are one and the same. So I think that being trustworthy is very highly correlated with being civic. And so we use that as a measure. So what are the relevant samples? As I said, we want to look at voluntary compliance. So we're going to look across US counties at the beginning of the pandemic. We have a survey of roughly 1,000 Americans done in early April. We look across European Union regions at the beginning of the pandemic. And then we have some data, very recent data of US counties at the beginning. And unfortunately here I put the first reopening because I fear there will be other shutdowns that are reopening, but you know what I'm talking about. So let's start with the first sample. We look at across US counties. And so the first picture I will show is a very simple picture obtained by doing the following regression. So we're going to put different measures of social distancing on the left. And then we're going to have county fixed effect, state time day fixed effect, some sort of a control for health, like I will explain in a second. And then we're going to look at the interaction between a dummy of the counties that are in the top quartile of the distribution of city capital and the day of the month, so that we see how this beta changes over time. And our health control includes the log number of COVID cases and also the log number of death, so that we control for that. And now look at this picture, and there are two very different measures. One is how much time you spend in places of retail and recreation, and these are changes vis-a-vis the benchmark. And so you see that in late February, early March, you have a bit of a change, but the big difference comes around March 12, when this is becoming the issue of COVID becomes very spread in the United States. And remember, these are differential, so the high city capital counties seem to have a much bigger drop in the amount of time that they spend shopping, let's say, than the other counties. Now, the red line is the time you spend around your residence. And now notice that not only this is completely symmetrical, so you spend much more time, but also, as you can see, there is a huge variation, and those are days of the week. Not surprisingly, Saturday and Sunday, you used to spend time at home even before COVID, so you don't see a lot of changes after COVID. And but the other days of the week, you see a lot of changes. And these changes, remember, this is the interaction with the high city capital counties. You see a lot more staying at home during the period in high trust or high city capital counties. We did a number of regression to show the same point. Here we interact with both the post-stay-home order and the post-national guideline. Now, the post-national guideline is completely collinear with a day fixed effect, so we don't estimate that separately because it happens for all the sample at the same time. The post-stay order are state order. What you see is when you interact especially the post-national guidelines with high city capital, you see that this has a negative coefficient when we look at the change in retail views, as a positive coefficient when I have a change in residential. This is true even if we control for the fraction of people voting for Trump in the last election. So this is not just a political variable. Now, we also did a survey in the period at the beginning of April, and this is roughly 1,000 US adults. And we asked a number of questions, but the most important one is how many people were in close physical contact with socially in the past 7 days, not including people that live with you. And here you see the result, 35% said none, and then the rest goes from less than 3 to more than 10 people. And then we ask on a scale from 1 to 5, where do I mean I don't trust them at all, and the 5 means I trust them completely. Can you tell us how much you trust other people in general? And this is the distribution of trust. Now, if that doesn't sound familiar to you in Brazil, don't worry, because Brazil is at the bottom of distribution in terms of trust of others. So I think that the results will be very different in Brazil than are in the United States. But then when we do a order approach, and we put on the left the various measures of social distancing, and on the right we put trust in other people, we see that trust in other people is negative correlated, which means that if you trust other people more, you social distance more, because remember here higher number means that you see more people outside. So it's the opposite of social distancing. Now, interestingly, people who trust the US government more seem to go out more. This is clearly a Trump variable. In fact, when we control for lean Republican, this effect of trust in government disappears. So there is definitely a ideological component. Republicans tend to go out more than the rest, but look at the trust in other people is robust to this measure, regardless of what you put else. And we also have a fear of getting sick. One of the questions we asked, that doesn't change. So this result seems to be robust. And we do the same analysis we did across US counties with the European social survey data at the NUTS 1 level, which is one level of regions. So the beauty of this is you control for country fixed effect, and then you look at what happens. And basically we have the same results that in area that have high level of trust, you see that people stay home more and they go shopping less as time goes around. And this is true even if you control for trust in politicians and so on and so forth. So the result is robust. Now, finally, when we were finishing this paper, the US counties were started to reopen. So we look at the mobility around state reopening. And this is just one variable. So this is the retail and recreation mobility. And the blue line are high civic counties, and the red low civic counties. And what you can see is that the low civic counties basically were starting to reopen even before the state mandate reopen and continue uninterrupted, while the high civic counties remain fairly stable even after reopening. So what are the implications? I think that, of course, we think that the level of social or civic capital of the country is important in designing a response to the pandemic. But we think that this is actually bigger than that, because if it is true that the values, the civic capital of a region are so stable and important, they represent a source of collective capital, enabling society to function better in general. So think about two countries or two that consider introducing some form of unemployment insurance. Then if your population is more civic mindedness, they probably are going to abuse the system less. And so the benefit of introducing unemployment insurance is much higher. Vice versa, if you think that everybody's going to abuse the system is going to have a gigantic deadweight cost, and so you're less likely to adopt this kind of insurance. So we think that beyond even the impact of the pandemic, which is big enough by itself, civic capital, it might be an essential source of a country's comparative advantage. Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi, for a great talk. As I said, I think all the three papers went together very well. We have some time for questions. People are supposed to send their questions to the chat.
Can I ask you a question to one in the meantime?
Sure.
I was very intrigued by your results, and I don't know the demographic of Denmark versus Sweden, but can make a political economy argument that, in a sense, the Danish system, let's call it the control system, is more beneficial to elderly people, and the Swedish system is more beneficial to younger people. So is it possible that the age distribution difference between Sweden and Denmark can explain why they adopted two very different solutions?
So I think the demographic distribution in terms of age across these two countries is pretty similar. I think that the best explanation I've seen for why Sweden didn't adopt social distancing laws is what you might think of as a constitutional quirk. So they have historically made it very difficult in their constitution to enact laws quickly that will affect civil liberties. So it really seems that they to some extent had their hands tied in terms of the response, in terms of being able to do something, even if their public health experts had recommended that they did. It turned out, in fact, that their chief epidemiologist and their public health authorities didn't recommend a shutdown anyway. I think that was actually similar in Denmark. So it was a government decision, not a kind of health based decision to shut down. Could I ask a question back? Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead. I have one, but I'll let you go first then.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to ask Luigi about how you think one can factor in civic duty into designing policies against COVID. So at least the evidence from Sweden and Denmark is that people say that the reason that the spending drop was so big in Sweden is because there's just very high civic duty. But we still see a lot more deaths in Sweden. So the extent to which you can use that civic duty to avoid that potentially bad outcome, how would you think about doing that with policy?
I think is a pretty simple idea in a sense. I don't think that a civic-minded country can internalize fully the externality. So we know that pandemic is the number one sort of example of externality. And civic duty is a way in which you partially internalize this externality. And actually, your evidence on the drop of shopping suggests that they did internalize quite a bit. Now, did they internalize enough to reach the central planner solution? Of course not. And that's where the externality comes in. So I think that I love your paper. I think it's very interesting because it suggests that even with civic-minded countries like Sweden, you probably are better off doing a shutdown. This, I think, ex ante was not obvious. And that's the reason why you do analysis ex post. But clearly, in a sense, with Sweden, you could have the question, will it work or not? With Brazil or Italy, probably you don't even have the question. So,
thank you, Luigi. I have a question for Ed, and I know he has a question that he may want to bring in, but I'll start with mine. Because, you look at Asian cities, you look at Tokyo. Tokyo seems to be surviving this epidemic much better as a city. Now, I think part of it, of course, is old habits. Japanese got into being super clean in the 19th century when the Westerners first brought some new diseases to Japan. But do you think that something like this could happen to U.S. cities and European cities? Could you become so minded of transmission of disease and so on that we would be that the cities could then function as well as Tokyo does?
It's a great question. I think it's harder to imagine in the US. It's easier to imagine in Copenhagen, right? I mean, you both need this sort of well-functioning civic capital that Luigi was talking about, which is very, very strong in Japan, and a very well-functioning government, which does contact tracing, that figures out how to do preemptive medical work. On both of these tracks, the US has a long way to go. Some parts of the US are closer than others, but I would say the Northern European cities are the ones that are closest. But certainly, it's the right question, and I think all of us should be looking towards East Asia and asking how looking at them and asking this is what actually good government looks like, at least for rich countries.
Yeah. So a comment on this is that even forgetting about COVID, if you're in Tokyo during the flu season, you see everybody with masks. So even though keeping social distance in Japan is pretty hard, especially on the subway, people seem in one way or another to avoid. I mean, the idea that somebody will cough or sneeze in public is impossible to think of. You won't see. So that's what I think that has done a lot. Now there may be other things, there may be contact tracing and so on, that helped a lot. But just the way that they conduct themselves seems to make a big difference.
Absolutely. There's an interesting map on the homepage of the New York Times right now on mask wearing across America, and I'm willing to guess it lines up pretty well with Luigi's measures as well in terms of civic capital. That it's been a very, very big push to get Americans who are so used to ignoring everything to actually wear masks in public.
I'll make you ask. Now it's time for you to ask your question. You sent a question, and
sure, absolutely. So Adam and I were carrying on a discussion afterwards and offline that I sort of wanted to raise, which is one of the things that appears to be really interesting in the U.S. is just in line with the Sweden-Copenhagen differences, Sweden-Denmark differences, is at the point of shutdown, even in high Republican states, the shutdown in restaurant activity preceded the legal shutdown. So people were afraid, people stopped moving around, and so you had that shutdown first. But at the moment of reopening, then there was a burst in restaurant activity, particularly in highly Republican states. So there's this really strong asymmetry between this. And at least for me, I wondered what we thought about the role. One interpretation of this is you have evidence before lockdown, the flow of the risks is going on around you. During the period of lockdown, the flow of new information dries up because you actually don't know what the actual risks of going to a hairdresser or a restaurant is. And so then you become more reliant on the government opening. And at least this episode, and I'm interested in both Adam's views and Luigi's views on this as well as yours, it seems as if the decision to reopen is not just taken as being a regulatory decision, but one that actually carries informational content. That many people, interpreted the reopening decision as being a signal that going to restaurants, going to hairdressers was safe, which they probably shouldn't have. And I think this is a sort of challenge for traditional libertarians if your sort of regulatory decision becomes so linked with the informational thoughts about whether or not this is risky or not. But I wanted to just throw that over to both Adam and Luigi about this temporal asymmetry between lockdown and non-lockdown. And of course, Luigi is right that the reopening was much sharper in high Republican states as well, of course.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I mentioned back to Ed when he raised this point was that one interesting small thing that we saw in Denmark around the reopening was that they opened hairdressers. That was a policy choice, that was important, that everyone could get their haircut again. And there was a massive rush. In fact, it was impossible to get a haircut for the first few days. And this was especially true among the elderly. So the elderly really increased their spending at hairdressers. And it was, at that point in time, totally unclear, in my opinion, I think probably recognized to some extent by policymakers, whether that was going to result in a spread of the disease. So I think certainly the decision, the personal decision as a person at high risk of contracting the illness, the personal decision to go to get your haircut is certainly plausibly influenced by the policy decision. That's kind of the small anecdote I have to contribute on that.
I would like to point out actually a limitation of what we are doing, because we look at civic capital as the characteristic of a community, but at each individual level. We ignore the possibility, of course, of social pressure and multiplicity of equilibria, in the sense that we know that what determines how you behave is in part your intrinsic motivations, so your values, but also a lot what other people do. So if all of a sudden everybody else stays home, you feel somewhat a scumbag not to stay home. If everybody goes to parties, then you feel less compelled not to go to parties. So I think that this aspect, of course, plays a gigantic role, and the role that governments play in shifting this equilibrium. We know in economics we're not very good at selecting equilibria to begin with. We're even less good in understanding how government authority might shift this equilibrium. And so I think that in order to understand some of this behavior, I think that we need to think about this, and this is, at least for me, not obvious, but maybe you, Ed, can model it properly.
I don't know. I mean, the other thing that's moving around here is belief of the risk of the disease, right? So in opinion polls, the Republicans are just much less scared of transmission than Democrats are. And there's an interesting question about public policy, which is, when is it right to lie about the risk of a disease to get people to internalize the contagion? So it seems pretty clear in the 80s when we were young that there was sort of a concerted effort to convince people that heterosexual sex was much riskier than it actually was. Probably for quite understandable policy reasons, that, you know, there's an externality associated with that, and we were trying to get people to avoid that. But that's sort of one thing that governments have traditionally done, is sort of by overstating the personal risk, the private risk, you get people to internalize some of the social benefit of restricting your activity.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I suspect that these days is really counterproductive to lie, because through social media, this is found out right away. And I think that I actually tell you this personal story. I have a very young RA, and I've been working with him a lot about trying to figure out various mortality rates, etc. And when finally we understood how different is the mortality rate between young kids and people of our age, and even worse, people older, this guy said, "Why did I stay home all this time?" And from that day on, he's out partying every night. So I think that it's very dangerous, in my view, to lie. And my impression is that some governments try at the beginning. They're still trying, because I've not seen much publicity about the difference in mortality rates, which are gigantic, really gigantic. And it says everybody knows that if you're older, you risk more. But basically, if you are in your 20s, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than to die of COVID. So I think that that's quite remarkable. Unfortunately, it doesn't apply for our age yet.
Yeah. So I want to ask Luigi a question. That goes back to this idea of trust and trustworthiness, because it seems to me that if places with high trust, places where people claim to trust other people, and maybe that's because they're trustworthy. If they take more seriously the pandemic, it's really about trustworthiness, not by trust. If I don't go, and take a voluntary act, I'm not taking the subway, for instance, that should signal that I'm trustworthy. Not that I trust people, I really trust that everybody with any signal of being sick would be there, then I'll show up at subway, because I trust all these people. So it seems that this results also indicate that trustworthiness is probably what people answer when they answer these questionnaires.
I suspect that's the case. Now, of course, it's very difficult to know, because if trustworthiness is geographically different, what you get is in equilibrium the expectation, which is the rational expectation. So if everybody's trustworthy, you trust other people, and you trust other people because you expect they are trustworthy. So I think that the two things are very much correlated. And I think in this case, it's clearly the case they are correlated. That's the reason why we use it. But you're absolutely right that the essential element here is not how much you trust, but how trustworthy you are. And that's the reason why I had that one slide, which actually built on some work I've done with Oliver Hart on trying to model this pro-social behavior, because I think that as economists, we tend to always go to the complete free riding equilibrium, which is probably right when the stakes are extremely large, but for small stakes, most people, not everybody, but I can think about some economists that even for small stakes will not do it. But I think we are at the extreme of the distribution. Most people for small stakes behave in a relatively civic-minded way. And I think that our models have not incorporated that very often, and I think we should go in that direction.
All right. So let me get to a question that was sent by Joaquim Bourdon. So he's asking a question I think we discussed already, but maybe Adam and Luigi can talk a little bit more about this. The idea that Denmark and Sweden have very similar civic capital, and so what do you think really was going on, Adam? Why didn't Swedes stay at home just as a matter of civic capital? So I think what Luigi answered is that, well, civic capital can only go that far. We still need some form of compulsion, and in this case, in Sweden, it seems that compulsion helped a lot, especially for the contamination for a small group of people. It seems that in Sweden, you had a disproportionate number of very old people getting contaminated, more than in other countries. In every country, a lot of, as a percentage of the people who died relative to the population, it seems that Sweden had a more serious case in which very old people, people in nursing homes and so on, very old people in general died. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So there was a real crisis in elderly care homes in Sweden. So I think that's a very good question. Yeah, it relates to the discussion that Luigi and I just had. So I think that the best results that we have to try to understand what's going on are this age gradient in the shutdown effect. And so one simple explanation is really the very simplest. I'm not saying this is true. It's just that the stakes are quite high for the young, for example, of avoiding. They're very low risks, so they can go out and enjoy. The old, the stakes are very high because the risk of them of fatality is relatively very high, and so they will extremely socially isolate. But what a shutdown can do is coordinate the action of all these groups of behavior, and that can benefit those people who are most at risk personally from the disease. And I think this point about potentially the transmission to care homes, so the shutdown effect among the young was about 10 percentage points difference between Denmark and Sweden. So the young, really 10 percentage points, I mean, it's in COVID era, it seems like a small difference in spending, but it's really gigantic when you think about any normal shock to the budget set. And so the shutdown in Denmark really constrained the choices of the young. And given that a lot of the young work in services, including personal care services and including in the healthcare sector, for example, old people's home, this is potentially one channel through which the shutdown works to protect the elderly. And so I think that the simplest interpretation of the finding, I would say, is kind of people worry about their personal health risks and respond in relationship to those. Of course, it could be that the age gradient that we pick up just reflects differences in civic, the trustworthiness across the age distribution. And I think that's something perhaps Luigi could shine a bit more of a light on.
Unfortunately, the paper we looked at this, we only looked at college students, right? So we don't have much of an idea. Ed has vanished.
I'm here. I was just responding to a thing online.
All right. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, I just come back to the view that Sweden, despite it all, looks much better than most of the world would have looked if they followed Swedish policies. I think that's actually just a critical thing. The other thing that I really want to echo is the one public policy thing that I think is obvious that we screwed up It's obvious, probably if we knew the death rate differences by age ex ante, we would have focused on it more, but we obviously screwed up is not to protect the nursing homes. This is relative to everything else that we spent, right? I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars of PPP, trillions of dollars of dislocation from different forms, right? For millions of dollars, we could have secured the nursing homes. For millions of dollars, we could have made sure that the people aren't going home, that the visits are behind plexiglass, that, you know, whatever it takes relative to, you know, this is 40% of American deaths are nursing homes, 60% in Massachusetts are nursing homes. This is the area that was, you know, just the low-hanging fruit and the critical thing that we should have been doing a better job on. And I suspect it's the same thing for Sweden.
Yeah, although I think the numbers in Sweden are even, I think they're even more, I mean, maybe Massachusetts got the Swedish numbers, you know, the 60% of the deaths were in nursing homes.
It's higher in the nursing homes where the workers are more likely to come from poorer districts, more likely to come from districts in which there's high public transit use, more likely to come from districts that are more likely to be minority districts. So it really suggests that if you could have kept them, if you could have, you know, paid them double time, triple time, quadruple time for them to stay at work rather than sleep at work, rather than going home, that you would have just saved a lot of lives potentially. I do also want to just stress, because Luigi is emphasizing a lot of the sort of personal care and mobility and the civic mindedness, and that is true, and that is one part of the story. But when we're talking about the zip codes in New York, these are not, you know, civic minded people in the rich parts of New York that are staying home and, you know, selfless people in the poor districts who are going to work. That's part of the equation, but also a lot of the heterogeneity is just driven by pure economic need, by differences in occupational mixes. And that takes nothing away from Luigi's paper at all, but just when we think about the heterogeneity in the mobility response, sometimes it's selfishness, sometimes it's you know, just this crisis just hit poor people in a very different way than it hit rich people, and our ability to respond by self-protection, by isolation, was just very different if we had resources than if we didn't.
No, I agree with you, Ed.
I knew you did. I wasn't.
No.
Yeah.
But that's the reason why it's important to factor in this civicness in an economic way, in which for small stakes you're willing to do it, for high stakes you don't, and for a lot of people who are on the verge of not being able to feed their family, these are very high stakes, and so of course they behave differently.
Also, there's the fact that these people, for instance, people that work in nursing homes, they were deemed essential workers. They were asked to come to work, and they were asked to go home. So, and there was no way for them to do that except public transportation. So in fact, you know, what result could you get out of this? You could only get contagion. It's not that these people lack civil capital or anything in this particular case. It's just those people were told to go home and go back to work. That's what Ed was saying, that you could have saved money and done it very well. And before we leave, I want you to talk a couple of minutes about, since we're here in Brazil and there's a lot of Brazilians in the audience, tell us a little bit about what you found, what you already know about the Brazilian case.
So the Brazilian patterns look a lot like the US. Unfortunately, I was hoping to have data on the impact of the municipal shutdowns, but we don't have that yet. I will say that I am not expecting to find very much, precisely because of Luigi's point, that in fact, often the shutdowns end up being relatively ineffective in low trust environments because they end up not being followed. And, you know, as we know, enforcement is the flip side of this, so we shall see. That certainly is you know, the impact of these non-pharmaceutical interventions we know from the US in 1919 during influenza were very minor. They did reduce the crest, so they diminished the peak mortality, but they didn't diminish overall numbers of deaths. So you just slowed those cities and towns that imposed those, slowed the overall spread of the influenza pandemic, but they didn't actually reduce the number of deaths. I would expect reasonably similar things in Brazil as well. The other things, obviously, that you've got to worry about in the developing world context is the impact of this on education. The impact of lockdowns on education can be absolutely severe. And certainly in many countries, and again, I'm not particularly mentioning Brazil, but in some cases, you've seen the reverse of what you've seen in sort of the Bolsonaro-Trump thing of, in fact, strong men embracing the shutdown because it gives them total control over the country. So in fact, far from saying, oh, this is nothing, go ahead and route your business. Oh, everything's shut down. I'm going to control exactly everyone who can go. And so for example, in the Ugandan context, at least for a while, you knew that more people had died from the lockdown than had died from COVID by a considerable margin, because you needed to get permission from your political leader to go to the hospital to give a baby, to deliver a baby, which is sort of a very extreme move in the opposite direction.
But one thing which is different about COVID, of course, is that there seems to be a difference how good a treatment you get, which was probably not true about the Spanish flu. I don't think we knew anything about the Spanish flu, how to deal with the Spanish flu when it occurred. So
actually, there was a rumor that early on, there were stories about a vaccine. Early on, there was a belief that there was a vaccine, which turned out to be false. So in fact, there were things that circulated like our current.
Yeah, but not in effectiveness. But I think the fact that if you just slow down the epidemic in places like the US and like Brazil, maybe not in Uganda, you get more people treated. Yep. So if you have a good health system, you can slow down, not happen what happened in places in Brazil like Manaus, where they ran out of hospitals beds. So part of that, the increase in death came from the fact that they couldn't just bring people to the hospitals.
Well, and in a grander scale, slowing down means we increase the probability of getting a vaccine, right?
That's
if you have if we can drag this thing out for 3 years, we have a reasonable chance of getting a vaccine before it or some form of a cure beforehand. So there are good reasons for dragging it out if you can possibly manage it.
Great. I think we are done with our time. I don't see any new questions. Brazilians usually don't ask many questions. That's my experience in Brazil. I don't know if Rui wants to say something or Alan.
We are in the mute.
Yeah, so maybe I can ask just a general question here. Like, I guess Ed mentioned some, but like, what do you see as the persistent or permanent effects of COVID in the economy? So cities may change. I guess like we had the discussion. I guess you mentioned something like that. But like, do you see any other effects that? One thing that surprised me from others' presentation is that spending recovered actually, if I understood correctly, actually quite quickly in Denmark. How do you see that happening? Even if you have but like, let's get. Even if we had a vaccine in the coming year, do you see any persistent effects on economic behavior overall?
Luigi, you want to go first on this?
I'm not sure, but because it's a very difficult question, but let me try. Yeah. So a lot of it, I think, depends on how long this will last. In a sense, if you, at the beginning, when we are hoping that this will be contained and 3 months later everybody will be back, I didn't expect this to have a very long impact. If this goes on for the next, at least winter in the upper part of the hemisphere, I think that it will have a long impact. I used to, actually, Rudy Dorbush had a fantastic story that he was telling us in class. And never verify whether it's exactly right, but historically right, but it's right enough that makes the point. He was telling that Boston was and this is true, Boston was the early financial capital in the United States. And then one winter, the Boston harbor froze and the New York harbor was not frozen. And because all the communication was taking place through ports, the traders moved for the winter in New York. And they never went back. So the reason why today New York is so important is in part, in his story, an accident. So I think that we don't know very well in economics how these focal points are determined and what gives their resilience. So all our models are basically variation around an equilibrium that is extremely stable. Okay, so making prediction is very easy when you have a model that is fairly stable. The moment you are unstable, this is, think about our own business. Will students come back or will they be happy to live in a Zoom world? And how this will change there is a massive experimentation. So the only thing I can say for sure is that there's been a massive experimentation, and I think the economy will be very different when we're going back to normal. So I don't think we go back to where we were. And in some cases, I think we're going to go back to a lot of more efficient way to produce. There will be a lot of redistribution along the way.
Yeah, I think it's going to take years to work our way through this. A lot of small businesses are going to shut down in the U.S. That's at this point in time absolutely inescapable, and that will have further implications. And it'll work its way through the system. Now, that just means they need to be replaced by new small businesses. So that'll just, there'll be a massive amount of churning. Places where regulations are tougher will make that churning harder. So maybe it may be an area to rethink the barriers to opening small businesses, particular for poorer entrepreneurs. I think real estate will unquestionably have a major churning. I think there's nobody who is invested in a large city commercial portfolio that doesn't expect very significant losses as a result from this. In suburban office parks, there's a little bit of a countervailing force, which is that people expect workers to have more space per worker, so that the overall demand for space may not drop quite as much. But I think we have every reason to expect that the sort of, even in the best case scenario, even if we have a vaccine in 2021 that proves effective, that this will be a significant dislocation. But if we take 1919 seriously, it says that in 3 or 4 years, we can get ourselves back in irrational exuberance and then head towards the crash of 1929, just like they did. So there's an optimistic way for us to wrap up.
2029 this time.
That's right.
Yeah. Adam, you want to say something? I want to make just one last point about what Ed said. But if you want to go, you can go ahead first.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that I would be a bit cautious about interpreting the recovery in Denmark as entirely kind of optimistic. I think that there's likely, and something we're looking into, is there's likely a lot of inequality in whose consumption has recovered. And it will take quite some time for the unemployment to filter through into spending. People have a 3-month notice period. And also Denmark being a small open economy, it's so hard when your economic, you rely on your neighbors having also controlled the virus. So I think that that's something that is going to be very important over the medium and longer run. Sorry to be less optimistic than Ed there.
So let me make one last point about what Ed said, which I think is very important, because we started talking about this as soon as COVID started. The idea of all these firms were going to be in trouble, and how important it is that these firms form a network, and how important it is that if this firm disappears, where they're going to be replaced. Now, we know that small firms, the bankruptcy process works very well for medium and big firms, but works very badly for small firms. So when small firms get in trouble, the bankruptcy system doesn't help them. So they lose whatever social capital or whatever capital they had for running the business kind of disappears. Now, that may be because there's not that much capital, that the reason big firms are preserved, the reason you may preserve a large company when they go bankrupt, like GM, because you think there's a lot of organizational capital in big businesses. So that's why people are willing to sacrifice part of their claims in order to keep their organizational capital. So that would be a good story. Somebody else will come in. But maybe it's because it just doesn't work well in spite of the fact that they have organizational capital. And if that happens, I think that gives a much longer run decline. Okay? Having used the privilege of the chair to speak last, I thank you guys. I thank you, Adam. I thank you, Ed. I thank you, Luigi, and Rui and Alan.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you in Brazil soon.
Okay.
Next year in Sao Paulo. Let's hope.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, guys. I have a question for Rui, just private question. How do I go to continue forward? There's another session I wanted to listen to, the one with Marcos and
I'll send you the link. I'll send you the link.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
you
you
very much.
We'll be in Portuguese, so you guys are not invited, the other guys.
Thank you.
Abraço.
Ciao, ciao.